المساحات المشتركة خلال تصميم المساحات الفنية وبنائها، والتناغم الجمالي المترائي لزوار هذه المساحات نتيجة لهذه العلاقة. يشارك في هذه الجلسة المعماريون وائل الأعور المؤسس لشركة واي والمعمارية سمية فالي المؤسسة لكاونتر سبيس، ويدير الحوار المعماري علي كريمي. Enjoy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ali Karimi. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this conversation, Blurred Boundaries, which will be a moderated talk between Wael and Sumeyya and myself on architecture's role in contemporary art. The title refers to the increasingly shifting boundary between the worlds of art and architecture, which both Wael and Sumeyya constantly kind of define or redefine the engagement of architects with the arts and with the public. And so for the inaugural Diriyah Biennale, it seems only natural to have a conversation on the role that architects can play not only in the creation of spaces in which these engagements with the public occur, but the longevity of these institutions, many of which are young, and finding their roles in a new region. I'm excited to introduce Wael and Sumeyya, two architects whose practices occupy the space between curatorial work, architectural exploration, and arts discourse. To introduce each, Wael Awar founded YY in 2009 as the principal architect after moving back to the Middle East from Tokyo. With interests in natural phenomena, landscape, and formless diagrams of relations, Wael has a multidisciplinary approach to design and is always looking to challenge conventional processes to push the boundaries of design. His projects layer his individual design sensibilities into an architecture of natural light, time, structure, and landscape. By aligning with natural phenomena, Wael seeks to create an architecture that is more than man-made fabrication, but instead remains open to adaptation and appropriation. The spaces that emerge from his approach are site-specific provocations that encourage unexpected experiences, activities, and behaviors. Wael was the curator of the National Pavilion of the UAE for the 17th Architectural Biennale in Venice and the winner of the Gold Lion Award. He has also had a great week with the opening of Hayy Jamil, which I think some of the people in the audience have been to. And so it's been kind of an incredible year for Wael, both in these, but in constant kind of dialogue with the arts, exhibition, and curation. As for Sumeyya, principal of Counterspace, a Johannesburg, London-based architecture and research studio, Sumeyya's design, research, and pedagogical practice is searching for expression for hybrid identities and contested territories. Her work is often forensic and draws on the oral, performance, the supernatural, the wayward, and the overlooked as generative places of history and work. A Time 100 Next List honoree and designer of the 20th Serpentine Pavilion, Vally is the youngest architect to be commissioned for the internationally renowned architecture program. She has recently worked on initiating and developing support structures, a new fellowship program launched at the Serpentine, an initiative which supports and networks artists working at the intersections of arts, ecology, arts and social justice, arts, and the archive. While he's currently serving as the Pelly Distinguished Visiting Lecturer at the Illinois School of Architecture. We'll begin by showing a few videos, first by Sumeyya and then by Wael with a few images, and then we'll have a conversation with a few questions, but we'd like to also welcome questions from the audience. We very much imagine it to be kind of an ongoing conversation, hopefully with your engagement.
Sabkha is an Arabic word that means salt flat. The salt flats of the UAE are living environments. They are constantly moving and reacting to the climate. They also absorb CO2. 1 square meter of Sabkha absorbs more CO2 than 1 square meter of rainforest. In our exhibition Wetland, we focused on the climate. Today, cement is 8% of global CO2 emission. It is a very serious problem that we have to address. To produce 1 ton of cement, you emit 1 ton of CO2. It's a very archaic material. If it was discovered or invented today, it would not be approved because the amount of CO2 that is emitted is just merely unacceptable. In order to find a new binder that can replace the lime in Portland cement, we started looking at the geography of the UAE and discovered the sabkhas. We realized that sabkha could be used to create architecture, but we did not at all want to promote the extraction of sabkhas. Hence, we started questioning where could we source magnesium oxide from other than the natural geography. We started turning towards industrial waste. This exhibition is a collaboration between us and Tokyo University, two laboratories, Sato-san's laboratory as well as Oguchi-san's laboratory, as well as a collaboration with New York University, Abu Dhabi, specifically the Amber Lab, and a collaboration with the American University of Sharjah, the Biochemistry Laboratories. In the exhibition, you see 3 large format pictures of safhas that are taken by Farah Al-Qasimi. The photos of Farah clearly capture this tension between industrialization, modernity, landscape, and nature. You can see the struggle that nature goes through to sustain itself with the need of countries to develop and build. We also have a prototype that is on display. The material is made from the reject brine of desalination water. We wanted to pay an homage to the vernacular architecture of the UAE. So the form or the shapes are inspired from corals. They are all drawn into soil molds and then cast. This cement needs to absorb CO2 in order to gain its structural strength. We've also on display sabha pieces that we've gathered from the local landscape and geography of the UAE, as well as some studies of different materials and cement experiments that we did in our laboratories in Dubai. It's important that architects of the 21st century start to re-question their roles and responsibilities. The architect lost touch of his role as a designer, the material, and the construction process. It is time that we hold ourselves accountable to the decisions that we make moving forward. Otherwise, there will be no planet left for us to inhabit by 2060.
You can cue the next video.
We need to ask ourselves if the world around us is being made in our image, and if it isn't, whose image is it being made of, and how do we start to make our own? When people are excluded or when stories are erased, it's a ravage of culture, a whole generation of thought that could have evolved out of that. My biggest inspiration is Joburg for all of its energy, all of its challenges, and all of its opportunities. The softness that there is in the quality of light, which I think is something really special about the city. I spent big amounts of my childhood in my grandfather's store in inner city Joburg, and I vividly remember walking the streets of Joburg as a child and really being in love with it from a very young age. There is a place of so many other places, movements, cultures, and different forces. People have found ways to make the city home. I think it's a testament to how resilient people are. When we were invited to make a submission for the pavilion, I really wanted to reflect what someone like me from our context and from our part of the world could bring to this pavilion. And I think that's something that Joburg has given me, or something that I strive for in my work, is always trying to read beneath the surface. And I really wanted to reflect a London that is plural and that is about many different places, that honors voices from many different times, past, present, and future. The role of an architect is to be able to absorb, reflect, and translate who we are into the world. We need to be able to listen deeply to these silences and whispers. There's a whole set of worlds that are waiting to happen inside of them. I often think about our identities and how different the world looks from different perspectives. architecture slanted in a very particular worldview that is very limited. And so I think that understanding how our different ways of being manifest differently visually, and then starting to explore what that can mean for architecture. My ambitions around building are very much about reimagining structures so that they reflect who we are. And we need to do that now.
Why? There's one more.
I'm Sumeyya Vally, and I'm the architect of the 20th Serpentine Pavilion. Counterspace is a design research practice based in Johannesburg, and we're focused on finding design form and design expression which brings together a multitude of voices from across the African continent and beyond. The idea for the pavilion originally came about because I was really interested in being able to express stories of place and stories of migration across London. London is a place of extreme hybridity. Everyone is kind of an insider and an outsider. We all embody that condition in different ways. I spent a lot of time when I first came to London at the Bishopsgate Library and Archive, and I worked through their pamphlet collection. I looked at events that were taking place around waves of migration that occurred in the city. The most important part about this pavilion for me is that it's conceived in 5 parts. There is the structure that we're sitting in now in Kensington Gardens, but then there are 4 other structures that are embedded in the city across London. There is a stage set at the Tabernacle in Notting Hill, the headquarters for the Notting Hill Carnival. There's a fragment at New Beacon Books in Finsbury Park, a bookstore that was one of the first in the UK with a focus on Afro-Caribbean and African diasporic literature. There is a seat at the Albany in Deptford, and then there is a fragment at the Valence House Library in Barking and Dagenham, and that will form part of a hub that's going to be a radio station. These spaces are also really important in how they function for communities, that people take care of each other's children, that women come together. Within all of these structures of gathering, there are moments of intimacy and exchange, there are moments for one-to-one conversation, but also the pavilion comes together to form a set of larger gatherings. I hope that when people come to this pavilion, that they'll feel the spirit of generosity that's embodied in so many of these places. As a response to COVID, I was struck by the generosity of bodies who actively hold these spaces. And so Support Structures for Support Structures was born to support up to 10 artists a year working at the intersection of art and ecology, art and social justice, and art and the archive, through funding, but also through mentorship and skills support. It really feels like a triumph to know that this pavilion has become a shared platform for so many voices to come together, and this pavilion is very much about embedding itself in London and about being able to fold London into the pavilion and the pavilion back out into London. And that was something that was at the heart of the intent of this pavilion from the very beginning.
Great. That's good. It's only 10 minutes.
Great. And so I think there'll be rolling slides of both architects' projects, and if anyone has any questions about them, they can ask later as well. Maybe we'll begin as with a kind of prelude to the blurring of boundaries. Both of you kind of mentioned your backgrounds, which I find fascinating. The sort of genetic material that has not only affected kind of your practices as architects, curators, but also how you look and how you work within the cities that increasingly you've had more and more engagements in. while coming from the background of Japan and Lebanon, now working in Dubai and choosing to base your practice in Dubai, but representing the UAE. Sumeyya, very much from this background of Johannesburg, Johannesburg as it moves out of the kind of the apartheid, and also now engaging with London, but finding ways of making those engagements. Could you guys maybe tell us a bit about the kind of the genetic material and how of where you're from and how it affects your practice?
Yeah, sure, of course. I think it really plays a big role in the production of space and in the way we think, or I think, definitely. And I'm somehow very comfortable when I am somewhere that is new. And I think that had to do with me growing up, always constantly moving. Lebanon was at a war when I was born, so we had to move out, and we were moving from city to city, trying to find a home, and then actually settled in Cyprus, which I would say the Europe for about 8 years, and then moved back to Beirut, where I did my university degree from AUB, and then moved out to Tokyo. So I can say I had 10 years in Europe, 10 years in the Middle East, then 10 years in Tokyo, and now 10 years in Dubai. So there's always this sense of movement. And I think, Dubai and Tokyo are very much different, but they're very much alike also in many ways. What's interesting is, I think, between the two cities is the way they've adapted to architecture. I mean, Tokyo, if you look at Tokyo, the Japanese culture, they've absorbed modernity, but still have kept their culture closely in some way. And Emirates is the same, They absorb modernity, but still they have somehow trying to preserve their culture within that modernity. While in Beirut is completely different. I feel the true Lebanese culture somehow is being mixed with a very westernized culture. But what I enjoy in Dubai is this multi-diverse culture, where truly we are in the office, maybe 5, 6 different nationalities practicing and thinking together. And I think this is what adds to architecture and art, this collective thinking from different backgrounds, and different ways of perceiving and understanding simple words even.
Yeah, I grew up mostly in Pretoria, but also in Johannesburg. I grew up at the fall of a very different kind of war. I was born in 1990 when Mandela was released from prison, just a few days after, actually. So on the one hand, I grew up in an apartheid township called Lodium, and it's an Indian-only township, and I grew up in a Muslim community, and it was this really jubilant, optimistic time in South Africa with the fall of apartheid and with this feeling of possibility and the rainbow nation, very different to the flavor of the country now. But at the same time, of course, there were also, and there still are, lots of very slow systemic things that have remained in the way that, I grew up very much in a cultural enclave. What that did give me is a very strong sense of community and of, a kind of engagement with community structures, a political solidarity, thinking through constructing belonging with the Muslim Ummah across the world also was a very important part of my upbringing, and kind of searching for a community beyond that enclave is also something that we've also always had to think through. I think also because my grandparents arrived just before the time of partition, there was also a kind of reconstruction around identity, an Indian Muslim identity at the time, and that, I think, perhaps works through thinking about the construction of identity through a Muslim lens more so than a patriotic Indian lens. And so there were all these, I think, confluences of the hybridity of my biographical identity, which is about growing up partly in Johannesburg, but also in this very close community in Pretoria. And then being from this different culture, but physically being in Africa, in South Africa. And something that I think perhaps I take with me to other cities is, as I said, this desire to read things beneath the surface, because South Africa is a place that has an inherited architecture like most places in the world, but that where architecture is very complicit in segregating people and was very directly engaged in politics and in separating people. But that now, in my architectural practice, has created a firm belief in architecture that is for the opposite, for bringing people together and for starting to blur different forms of public and different, bringing into being other ways of being that need to manifest and need to rise and surface and surge. And I think just also thinking about this idea of blurring boundaries, there are so many forms of space making from other ways of being in our own cultures that are not only focused on static buildings and on architecture as we know it, but also think about atmosphere and about intangible things like dress and ritual as really important forms of space making. And that's something I think I learned to read in Joburg, but that I look for everywhere.
And maybe to kind of, since you mentioned the kind of blurring of these boundaries, I mean, one of the things that I think makes both your practices so interesting, Wael, maybe the involvement with one of the most important art spaces in Dubai, and now also increasingly in Saudi Arabia, this kind of background that now transitioned you into not only, let's say, someone who's imagining the role of these institutions as an architect, someone who's organizing the spaces, but very much thinking about how these institutions are meant to grow. What role, for example, do you think is the architect playing in imagining new institutions?
You know, the question I ask myself is that, you know, what was the 20th century architect and what should the 21st century architect be? And I think sustainability is at the key, you know, at the heart of everything. And when I say sustainability, I don't only mean environmental sustainability, but also, you know, economic and also the lifespan of architecture, you know, adaptability, and that is very important. And I believe, you know, today I try to look at architecture as something that needs to constantly be able to readapt to changing circumstances. And, you know, we cannot predict anymore. You know, we used to predict certain programs and design buildings with very fixated understanding of how they would function. And we'd be obsessed with controlling that program within the layout of space. But today, buildings, you know, are changing constantly. Programs are changing constantly. What is art today is not necessarily what is art next month. And so how does architecture react to that? And a building can only be successful if it is sustainable enough to constantly shift. So I think in that way, as an architect, I try not to think about program as much as think about activity maybe, or the way that we can see people reacting within certain space. And then most importantly is these, you know, having these different programs and how do you cross, you know, let them intersect with one another in different ways. In Hay Jamil, you know, I really focus much more on the design of the courtyard space and, you know, the space of gathering and bringing people together, and how these, you know, how these different disciplines can just step out from their rooms and sit with one another outside and have a conversation. And then how could that feed into their own work? So this is, I think, is key to how we think as architects. We need to re-question our systems and how we were trained to think. In wetland, it was a different way of really thinking about chemistry and biochemistry and in the sciences rather than in the control of the making of certain, you know, spaces.
Sumaya, maybe the same question, but also different, because suddenly, I mean, the Serpentine, especially as an architect, there's been this lineage of architects, many of whom well known. The questions that they bring to the table are also particular to their practices, but it's an institution that, let's say, has built its own kind of narrative, and it's built its own way of seeing things, and has very much led to a certain way of seeing architecture. So maybe as someone who's kind of coming to London with a set of different questions, different perspectives, what role and what questions do you bring into that kind of architectural question of where the blurring happens and how it can happen?
I think I was very critical in the beginning of the platform of a pavilion itself. And of course, I'm interested in ephemerality and in temporality, but I'm also interested in asking questions about what we can do with platforms. Even a platform like the one we're sitting in now, a platform like a Biennale, thinking about the seeds that it plants and the legacies that it starts to seed is an important question that I think we're seeing to be so generative over the last few days. The pavilion really, you know, it started with this question of how to think through something temporal that can have an impact and that can also pose a question as a manifesto, rather than project an answer or project a singular vision. And so when I started to think about it like that, I really wanted to think about bringing other voices into the conversation, of course about working with many partnerships, and as we saw in the film, there were many art and community institutions involved in bringing the pavilion together. There were also ghost voices involved in the form of much of the research that I worked through in libraries and archives. But also in the Serpentine itself, I'm very lucky that I got to work curatorially with their team. And I think that I agree with Wael, we need to look at our training again, but there's something also in the training of an architect that is about being able to see things from a very zoomed out lens, and that's often why architects blur into urban and city works. But I think there's also something about being able to see a system from very, you know, in all scales, the scale of the tiniest detail to how something fits into an ecology, or at least these are things we should be thinking about more and more. And so I think I was very lucky in that I got to also blur the work streams between the build and construction team at the Serpentine and the civic team and the ecology team and the public programs team, the park nights team. All of these teams started to speak to each other a lot more, but also started to engage with me as the architect. And this, I think, is something that's a little bit different for the Serpentine, because usually the understanding is that the architect hands over the building and the curators the curators then take on the programming. But because, and this is also why my practice is now partly based in London, the pavilion started to ask me to be more directly involved in facilitating the engagements around it. So I was very much in the background of all of those engagements, but I was involved in programming its life in a very big way. And you know, I think that this is something really important in expanding the role and the voice of the architect, but also in putting the responsibility of asking these questions on the shoulders of the architect, because many times I think architects shy away from politics, even though we're always making something that sits within a political agenda, whether we're conscious of it or not. We're perpetuating sets of politics. So, you know, starting to take those questions on more directly, I think, is becoming more and more important.
Actually, that kind of it brings up one interesting thing that I think Wetland was doing, was that of the maybe the pavilions in the, especially in the Gulf, but in pavilions in general, it was one of those rare cases where it's not something which is revealed in Venice. It was very much something which had a life even before the competition, but it was something that you could see, and I think particularly in the context of the pandemic, you could see the project grow and develop, and it was kind of a lab in which you knew what the pavilion would be. Well, you knew what the pavilion would be, but you didn't know how it would be until it happened. So maybe also could you tell us about how Wetland was programming and how the duration of the Biennale, particularly in the UAE, was it reimagined? Not just as a thing in Venice, but something living.
Yeah, I mean, Venice was a pit stop within a research program, yeah. And I kept telling the National Pavilion that, and we weren't really certain what we were going to be presenting because it was an ongoing research and we didn't know how far we would get into the research. Actually, the pandemic really helped us in having an extra year in developing that research and being able to produce a prototype of that scale. Otherwise, I think we would have presented something very different. And, you know, and I always said, you know, you have to not worry too much. We might build something that collapses because once you're trying things for the first time, you might fail. And you have to accept failure in that sense, yeah? Going back to the idea, the question of having a lab and being able to constantly experiment is something that is very different to how I live my the other half of my life in YY office, yeah? So I actually split my time in half. So 2 or 3 days I'd go to the lab space where, you know, we're constantly re-questioning, experimenting, and then other 2 or 3 days I'd go to YY where we're really thinking about building projects and me having to answer very pragmatic questions about construction sites. And I think that duality is very important, you know, in the life of a practicing architect. Because today, you know, we cannot accept that we just live in a certain comfort zone, right? You know, you can't be satisfied with just doing what you've been trained to always do, but you always want to try to go somewhere new or try something different. And that is where you need to step out into more of a lab space. And the interesting thing in Wetland that it took me to biochemistry and other fields in the sciences where I had no idea of certain things, even geology and geography and looking at minerals and things like that. So I had to learn that from scratch, but it really gave me a lot that I could take to my practice, or I can now bring to my practice.
Maybe let's take one from the audience.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Sumaya, I wanted to ask you, because actually Wael brought up this topic of a lab and experimentation. And I'd be interested to understand the kind of experimentation or maybe lab process that you might adopt yourself. And is this something that came in relatively new, or is this something that came in later? Is this as a result of maybe, you know, you said how much you were involved from a multifaceted perspective with the Serpentine Pavilion. And I wonder if that also changed the way that you practice, or maybe the methods, your methodology.
Thanks so much for the question. We talked about this in the beige room, actually, just before, because we were reflecting on our ages. I've always had also different spaces from the beginning of my career. So when I first graduated, I immediately started to run a master's studio. I was working in counter space, and I had a full-time job at a museum and curatorial practice. And it was very important for me that those 3 very full-time endeavors happened at the same time, because they allowed me to think through things at different paces. Very similar to what Wael said. I think, especially in Johannesburg, there's this pressure to answer very urgent social questions all the time. We have questions of service delivery, housing, schools, you know, the provision of infrastructure that's very urgent. But I think that sometimes there's a deeper social project that's being lost around deep experimentation, around being able to think through the expression of hybrid identity, about thinking through deep questions of representation that can easily fall away if an architect is focused on just a very singular kind of emergency crisis provision situation alone. And so I do think it's very important to be able to practice at many different scales and at many different paces at the same time, because those spheres kind of keep each other really sharp. And so I've always had a slow research practice happening alongside the fast, bold process of making artworks and installations and the kind of steady practice of making buildings. And I don't think I've thought through this enough before, but also the process of working in a museum practice early on really was formative to the way that I formed my architectural studio, because I came in as an architect working on immersive installations and exhibitions, but I got to work with content, narratives, and a content team that was deeply engaged in actively researching histories of my own country that we'd never discovered before. For example, the histories of women voices in the struggle, and many, many other really important stories that were waiting to be surfaced, which I think has been really formative in my practice. But also being able to, as an architect, work in that space. And when I arrived at the firm, we worked with they were working with perhaps much more of a traditional focus towards exhibition, which then started to become more and more open to being immersive. And we worked with, film and sound composers and lots of different disciplines at the same time. And that's something that I've worked to carry in my architectural practice as well, because I think on the African continent in particular, but here as well, I think perhaps the global south, for want of a better word, or the southern condition, South London is, as for me, a global south is South Africa. We need to be able to realize different forms of practice, and we need to be able to be working with lots of different disciplines in the process of making architectural space, because I believe that so many of them are much faster, much more fluid, and much more agile at answering spatial questions. And architecture, unfortunately, traditionally is very slow, very white and very male, very Western-centric. And because it's so abstract, I think we're not seeing enough just how oppressive it is. But there's a whole set of worlds waiting to be imagined from places of difference.
Thank you.
Maybe one more? Sure.
I think I'm gonna pose this to both Wael and Sumaya. I mean, obviously, you guys have talked about your various approaches to architecture, but I mean, what do you envisage in terms of the future, particularly in the region? Because I know both of you have obviously a lot of contact with the region as well. I would pose this more as in what would you advise the people who have the ability to now develop all of the infrastructure that they're doing? Because when we look at the Middle East, we're lucky that we're able to basically create. We're not readapting things that already exist. We have the opportunity to actually create spaces and curate them and build them and design them. What would you imagine or envisage would be insight or advice for future approach? Challenging question.
Good question, but I mean, I don't know if I can give advice about this, but I'll just tell you what I think. I think the region. Why I am in Dubai, I'll tell you, and why am I here today in Riyadh is because I believe there's a lot of fertile ground here that you can really plant seeds in, and that you can, and I see a very optimistic future in a way where there's this gathering of so many great and interesting people that we can sit and have conversations and imagine the future together and discuss this future together. Other than that, about pragmatic things, I mean, about building things from scratch versus, you know, reappropriating or readapting. I think the Biennale site here being, you know, a readapted site is great. I think this multi-layering approach is much more interesting than building cities from scratch. I think spaces have memories and have certain characteristics that when you reappropriate them will give a lot more value and meaning to the space. And that I find very interesting, and I think is a good way to go about it rather than finding empty plots and trying to build always from zero. That's not necessarily the right way to do it, I think.
I'm in no position to give advice, but I think maybe just reflecting also on my position and on conditions that I find really interesting and inspiring. I find this condition immensely interesting and inspiring because, as you said, there is, you know, the whole world to be imagined from here. But I think that there's also something so special about the voices that are coming from this place right now and from this moment in time. Politically, culturally, the confluence of so much change that's happening, but also the reflecting on the richness of the history that exists here as well. I think there's so much conceptual material here that's waiting to be translated into form. And I think there's also huge opportunity for us to, from these lenses and perspectives of difference and from these, for want of a better word, non-Western or much more hybrid lenses, there are different angles to questions and crises that we've inherited around, you know, everything from politics to climate. Of course, that I think the region is also thinking through deeply. But beyond just being able to ask questions differently, I think if we look at the material that's here, there's so much that's so interesting and that I think is food for being able to create systems differently, for being able to create form differently, and for being able to imagine differently.
Thank you.
Hi. Just want to respond to what Sumayya was saying just now. Me as a Chinese artist, having the interest, well, I developed my interest in Islamic art through reading art history in books and on social media. But when I came here, like really, I was so inspired by the sense of space here. The sky that is very different from what I saw in China or in the US or in the UK, and the palette of the bricks, of the soil, and you know, everything really inspired me to think about how I can imagine. I'm a painter, so how I can think about painting differently, how I can use references differently. And I just totally agree with what Sumayya was saying, that this is a completely different system of art and thought that will generate a new way of thinking, a new way of making. Yeah. And I'm really grateful to be here. It has been a very inspiring experience. Thank you.
I think, sorry, that's so, yeah, really beautifully and poetically put, and it's making me reflect on something. Earlier in the year, I was working with a group of students, and a Nordic student told me, it's really interesting to hear you speak so passionately about all of these conditions of change and flux, but I'm from a place that's very homogeneous, and you know, how do we start to think about difference from this place? And I said some of the things that you're saying about that place, that there are so many different words for the color of snow, and there are, you know, there are so many conditions to do with the amount of light, with you know, the way that the stars and the constellations are used for navigation. So I think there's something really interesting in the approach or approaches that come from listening to place rather than only always projecting ourselves onto it. And I think there's something deeply empathetic about this form of practice that you're describing, which is reflected so beautifully in your installation, and congratulations to you. MashaAllah.
I was hoping Todd would ask a question. I've really enjoyed hearing more about your work, and especially to the use of videos. I wanted to push back a little to really both of you have been very eloquent in talking about the kind of potential that architecture can provide, and I'm an architect as well. I also believe, though, that architecture is ultimately a top-down profession. The way we're trained as architects is very much top-down. Even, the clients with whom you've worked on pavilions or representing states or large corporations, we ultimately feed off that sort of, that's where our bread comes from that layer of society. And yet you're both very much engaged trying to make architecture open and engaged. I guess I would be curious to hear from both of you how you deal with that, essentially a paradox in your practice.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very good question. I mean, it is a top-down approach, architecture, and I think what Sumayya was touching upon earlier is about re-questioning these systems and trying to find new systems. And I mean, the way we are educated as architects allows us to tackle problems, I think, quite efficiently. Yeah, we can see things in 3D, and we can imagine solutions probably somehow. I'm not saying we are really the problem solvers, but maybe we have tools that help us approach problems differently. Of course, I mean, we need to re-question the systems that have been built into us. And in wetland, I mean, in wetland specifically, the collaboration process was about this re-questioning of how we have been trained to think and approach things, but trying to really produce something that is different from the way I've been geared or programmed to always react to certain situations. And even the prototype and the design of the prototype itself that we presented was about being the antithesis of modern architecture, or the role of the architect in producing space and architecture itself, and trying to let go somehow of our obsession with control as architects. The prototype didn't have a single drawing. It was more of a process manual that you give to certain builders, be it students or contractors or whatever, that teaches them a process, and each one has to imagine his own process and participate in that process. And not having a drawing at all is a very uncomfortable situation for an architect, and not being able to imagine and see your end result, which you are so obsessed with usually to control, right? And trying to break down those systems and imagine new systems or new ways in order to produce maybe new forms of architecture where I think craft and identity can play a bigger role in the production of space.
Architects never always had drawings. I think when we think of some of the Mughal palaces that were built and so on, that was like warfare. The architects imagined everything in their heads and then would be executed afterwards so that there was no competition. It was entirely an embodied experience, which is, crazy to imagine. Just reflecting on the processes of control. I think there is, I don't know how to word it articulately, but I still do believe in the agency of the architect. And I lost a dear friend recently who said famously that young architects will change the world by not building buildings. And we had several conversations and arguments about this, because I think that architects should not only be engaged in buildings, and I believe very much in architecture in the expanded field, that we need to have architects who are working in many different ways, not just building buildings, but architects also should be building buildings, because the buildings that we have are not representative of so many of our ways of being, and we need to reimagine and reinvent them. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I believe in small A architecture that is interested in practicing in many different ways, that engages in many different disciplines and boundaries, because I agree with Wael, our training allows us to work through so many different kinds of things to do with space, from policy to urban things, art installations, immersive environments, you know, thinking about how things manifest, how language and cultural things start to manifest a space. But I also believe very much in the agency of the architect, and I think that I believe very much in engagement and in listening, but I've never been an architect who's said that, you know, I defer to the voice of the people alone, because I think that it's still the responsibility of the architect to translate. And so we need to be able to listen deeply, but the responsibility still falls on the architect to translate, as it does, I think, with many other creative disciplines, to translate, to read between the lines, to read beneath the surface, and to provide and question with something that came out of that engagement. So I think it should be at the same time top down and bottom up, but that the responsibility still should, or architects should hold responsibility of being able to translate.
Great. Wael, Sumeyya, thank you so much, and thank you guys for attending. And yeah, maybe we can speak a little after. Thank you.